Topic notes 4.2 Plankton. This is a picture of MacArthur Beach State Park on a particularly nice day. But I want you to focus out on that horizon and just that whole wide ocean out in front of you. Oceans, like any other ecosystem, relies on energy input from the sun and producers. However, you don't see a lot of plants and trees out there. That's where plankton comes in, and we're really going to focus on that today. It took scientists a while to figure out, but plankton are really critical not only to ocean ecosystems, but also to our atmosphere and the amount of oxygen we have in there. So let's get started. So our main idea today, plankton forms the basis of the marine food web and plays an important role in the larval development of the majority of marine life. Here are learning goals. First off, very simple, define the terms plankton and nekton. Basically, be able to differentiate between the two. Discuss the role of plankton and zooplankton within the marine food web. Classify the major groups of phytoplankton based on major characteristics. And then compare the two various lifestyles of zooplankton, specifically meroplankton and holoplankton. And of course, discuss the distribution and movement of plankton communities in the ocean. So we're going to get started today with our non-example, and that's Nekton. Nekton is basically anything that can actively swim against a current. Fish, whales, dolphins, all that stuff. Okay? They are not beholden to ocean currents or tides to get around. They can push their way through whatever and go where they want to go. That's defined as Nekton. That, of course, is a little bit different than the concept of plankton, which is completely the opposite. Plankton are described as a group of organisms that cannot swim against a current. They drift, basically. That's exactly what they mean. They're drifters. They drift around based on the water currents and the tides and wherever that's going to take them. Now, plankton includes a great variety of organisms from various different phyla. So don't think that it's just a taxonomic term. It's just a category that encompasses autotrophs, phytoplankton, all that kind of stuff, heterotrophs, predators, grazers, you name it. Even large jellyfish are considered plankton. So the ranges of even the sizes of plankton are quite varied. Now, plankton can be subdivided by just that, size. Here's just a few subdivisions. We have Phytoplankton, which is generally composed of viruses, which are very, very, very small. Phytoplankton, which consists of archaea and bacteria. Now, both of those, Phytoplankton and Phytoplankton, tend to be so small that they don't get caught in standard plankton nets, and that's what you see pictured on the right. Now, there's then a big category of what we call net plankton, and net plankton is large enough to be caught by our standard plankton nets. And we are going to talk a little bit more about plankton nets a little later on. It's important to note that these size categories are not evolutionarily linked. They're not phylogenetic. It's just based on sizes. But also to note that all categories of plankton support the majority of the marine food web. So there are two basic types of plankton, zooplankton and phytoplankton. So we're going to start with zooplankton, which, as the name implies, animal-like plankton. Right? They're basically heterotrophs. All right? They can be primary or secondary consumers, and they generally are primary and secondary consumers of other plankton. Now, phytoplankton is the opposite. It is plant-like plankton. All right? They're autotrophs. They go through photosynthesis, and they provide about 92% of marine productivity globally. So they really do support a vast majority of the food chain and the food web in the ocean. And really, even zooplankton provide that link too, because they tend to be that first trophic jump between phytoplankton and, of course, the zooplankton that consume phytoplankton. So phytoplankton, very important. So there's a few different types of phytoplankton that we're going to cover, and there's quite a few more beyond that. The first are diatoms. Diatoms, again, photosynthetic. You can kind of think of them as photosynthetic algae. They have these siliceous skeletons called fustrals, and they tend to be one of the most common you're going to see in the planktonic community. The picture below on the left shows you a micrograph of a fusterill, and then on the right you'll see a little animated diagram showing you kind of the top and bottom capsules of the fusterill. They are extremely common. We see them a lot, and they have various different forms. What you're seeing here is more of the kind of centric kind of capsule form, but they also form pillows. They like cushion-like things. They can be pinnate. They can even form these chains and colonies. So here's some more images showing you some of the variety of diatoms that you'll see, and some of these you'll actually see in our lab. And I will also refer here once and probably many times. There's an additional video to this that really goes through this process of collecting the plankton and showing you exactly what we tend to see in our plankton toes here locally. So here's another type of phytoplankton called a dinoflagellate. Now, dinoflagellates tend to be unicellular, and they have usually one or two of these whip-like flagella that help them move around. Now, when we say move around, we're not talking about the fact that they can fight a current, but they can move around within their little generalized area. They tend to have armor plates of these carbohydrate cellulose sort of material, and they, again, are autotrophs. They are also related to plankton blooms, and even more specifically red tides, if you've ever heard about that. They tend to be different types of dinoflagellates. So not all dinoflagellates are bad, obviously, but those who play a part in red tides are a bit of an issue. Red tides generally are going to occur when you have an overabundance of nutrients in a particular area that allows them to really grow and explode in population. Red tides often cause breathing problems and respiratory problems with people, but they can also have problems with the local marine life that you have, both fish and even marine mammals. There's also several different types of dinoflagellates that are part of what we call zooxanthellae, the algae that live inside the coral tissue. So they're all sort of connected. Photosynthetic bacteria, also known as cyanobacteria, also play a big role in the ocean, providing a lot of oxygen. They were actually some of the earliest known forms of life and were responsible for the initial boost in O2 levels that allowed aerobic life to evolve on land. This cyanobacteria actually accounts for about half of the ocean's primary productivity, so it's the most abundant phytoplankton around. Now, there are filamentous forms that can actually be caught in plankton nets, and we also have some forms that actually will grow on the bottom, like you see on the picture at the bottom. Sometimes seeing too much cyanobacteria, especially in its filamentous forms, can tell you that there's too many nutrients in the water. This often happens during events of eutrophication, especially in coastal regions. As we begin to turn our attention to zooplankton, it's important to note that zooplankton are very important herbivores. They are the link between the phytoplankton and higher trophic levels. And the first category we'll talk about are protozoan zooplankton, which tend to be able to catch and digest those small phytoplanktons, the phytoplankton that are so small and much smaller than any other herbivores can access. These include various different types of flagellates like ciliates, foraminiferans, and radiolarans that I have pictured there on the right. Now, it's also important to note that many of these grazing protozoans are actually capable of photosynthesis as well. Solidly in the zooplankton category are copepods, which are these small crustaceans that dominate the net plankton. They account for about 70% of the community, and they graze on phytoplankton, but will also be carnivorous as well if given the opportunity. They actually use their appendages to create water currents that bring food close enough to grab and consume. Now, moving up in size, we also have krill. Now, krill are shrimp-like zooplankton that can grow up to about 6 centimeters in the Antarctica. They feed on phytoplankton, zooplankton, and detritus, so they sort of are omnivorous in that extent. And they're large enough to be important food sources for large animals such as seabirds, fish, and even whales. Now, a lot of the zooplankton we've talked about so far are considered holoplankton, meaning that they remain plankton their entire lives. Copepods and krill are example of this. The other category is meroplankton, and this is plankton that only spends part of their life as plankton. Generally, this means they're going to be larval forms of a lot of the different species that you know of in kind of larger body sizes, such as crabs and shrimps and fish and clams and conchs. In this slide, you can see a couple of examples. There's a larval tube anemone on the left, and a little juvenile larval octopus on the right, and of course a larval fish in the center. There are so many examples, and when we do our plankton lab, I'm sure you'll see quite a few larval zooplankton that fall under the meroplankton category. It's important to note how important the plankton community is to the marine environment, because almost all the animals that you see in the ocean spend part of their time as plankton as well. So I'm just going to make a few notes on the distribution of plankton in general in the ocean. We're going to go into this a little bit more in depth, especially in terms of phytoplankton in the next lecture. But first of all, plankton communities are limited by available nutrients. It's a big thing. We actually mentioned this, I think, in the previous lecture too. So in the open ocean, you're going to have localized aggregations or patches based on where there's nutrients coming from wherever source, generally some sort of upwelling. Now, species that feed on plankton, they tend to have to follow or find those patches, and they might not be specifically eating phytoplankton, but all of the other zooplankton that are going to be there as well are involved in this as a whole food web. Now, you might guess that coastal regions tend to have more nutrients in certain circumstances, especially with runoff from land. They also tend to have more what we call meroplankton, or the part-time plankton, if you will, because there's a lot of invertebrates and invertebrates that live in those coastal zones and release their larvae there. And one of the last little bits we'll talk about is vertical migration within zooplankton. So zooplankton are basically being preyed upon by just about everything. And so one of the things that they do, and this was actually a little bit of a surprise for scientists when they were actually doing various different types of sounding to look at depth within the water, all of a sudden in some instances in the ocean, it looked on the data like the seafloor was rising up to meet them, kind of like a big spaceship from the abyss coming up or something crazy. Well, what it was is that the plankton, specifically the zooplankton, will actually go down into the depths during the daytime, and the thought behind this is that it probably helps them avoid predation. Then at night, they come up to the surface to feed on the phytoplankton that's up there. And so this migration, vertical migration up and down, is something that occurs daily throughout the world. In this graph, you can actually see the time plotted on the bottom, and you'll notice the section where the krill literally drop towards the deeper depths and then rise back up again. Very cool. So I'll tell you something else that's very cool, and that is looking at live plankton. And that's, of course, the point of our plankton lab coming up. And we were going to be collecting, I'm going to be collecting plankton for you, and I'm going to do it very similar to what you're seeing on this picture. It's using a plankton net. And this plankton net will help to concentrate plankton in the back end of the net. It's what we call a cod-in. Anyway, I'm going to again refer you to the additional video. This is a very short note set for a good reason. I want you to go and watch the other video that will actually show you the process of me actually collecting plankton and giving you another bit of a review of some of this information we've covered today. So it's time to throw it back to you. Here's your in-depth question. Large baleen whales like gray whales and blue whales and humpbacks, and even whale sharks feed primarily on plankton communities. How can such small organisms provide such food for the large, massive organisms, some of the largest on the planet? That's what you're going to have to think about. All right, till next time, keep thinking.